All right. All right, y'all. So, like I mentioned earlier, we have been going through a lot of content with regards to this React stuff. We started off learning about components, and from that, we had to learn JSX, which is the syntax for writing components in React. Components essentially are comprised of these different React elements that are both intrinsic elements from HTML that we can use in JavaScript, as well as elements in that we can create of our own, right? And those are what we call components, these custom kind of containers of these elements that we make to style and create our application. We talked about rendering those components in the different ways. There's two different ways of doing that. We talked about functional components as well as class-based components. And in that conversation of creating these different types of components, so here we see a functional component here and a class-based component for with the same elements. After talking about components in general, we got started talking a lot more about the process of working with data with regards to these components. So thinking about the two different formats of how we can share data in the component lifecycle, both one being props and one being state. Props, hopefully you remember, is data that is passed into a component from its parent, and that data is fixed. It can't change. It's set as a constant, so it cannot change, but the component can make use of it inside of itself. So here in this example of this class-based component, we see that not only is this component rendering a little bit of text in this heading, it's also using props to pass some specific data that will print in as well within this message. So props is great for when you want a component to know about some data as it renders, and you don't expect that data to change. The other format of data that you can utilize with working with components is called state, which is similar and different than props, right? It's similar in the sense that all components can utilize state, but what makes state different than props is that state is data that the component can create that will change over time. So whereas if I were to be using props, I can't change whatever the data inside of props is. State is a set of data that can change over time. And so when you use state in a component, you're able to set some variables in an object, right, that can be referenced inside of your code base as your component is rendering, or wherever. If you're running specific functions, whatever the use case is, you can make use of this variable inside of your components in general. So components are objects, JavaScript objects, which mean that they are a data structure that has key value pairs. And so you set a state variable. A state object has certain keys that you would refer to with the dot syntax. So like this dot state dot date, as you see here in this example, is referencing this dot state, which is this object we're creating here, and this date property that we set. You can have multiple properties in your state. You just separate it with a comma. And yeah, the cool thing about state as it relates to props is that state can change. And so in order to change state, you can utilize a specific function to manipulate the state. And that function is called set state when you're working within class-based components, I should mention. So here's an example of that function here. The set state function, it basically is a function that you call inside of the class-based component, and you can pass a new object with more data for the state to keep track of. So you can either update existing data in this function, or you can add new data to the state at that point in time as well, with also just separating things with a comma. So working with class-based components is really great because you actually are able to really easily create the state variables and objects inside of your constructor, and then make use of them by using this dot state syntax inside of your class-based component. And again, the value of doing this is that you can manipulate these components in order to have some types of dynamic things changing over time within your component in general. Props is great when you're passing data, and props is really how two components talk to one another. A parent component to a child component can talk via props. And so when you're considering like, oh, I have one component and I have another component on the same page, and I want them to communicate, the only way really to get them to communicate is via props, right? Somebody has to pass data into the other. But if the data is going to be changing over time, you're going to want, maybe one of those components might be using state to keep track of data that's changing over time before it passes it as a prop to another component to use. So a good example of this is in some previous examples, we've worked on like creating a form. And inside of the form, you have different, people are typing different things. And as they're typing those different things, you want to keep track of each item that they submit, right? And so in order to keep track of all the items that folks are submitting, that would require us to have some type of data structure to just hold all of those items, right? And so in typical senses, right, an array might be a great data structure for that. So creating an array would be good, but we don't really expect that array to stay fixed with one value over time, right? So it might not be a good idea to save that in props, but we do expect that array to change over time. So that would be a great use case of something like state. So I'll pull up an example of that from one of the older code bases that we were working on and just take a look at it. But at the same time, I hope it's making sense to y'all that state and props are two of the most important aspects of working with components that is really important to understand, because you're always going to have some data related to your application that's going to be changing over time, or just need data communicated from one part of your website to another part of the website. And that's where state and props respectively come in to play a role in your React apps. So let's just take a look at this from more of like a code base perspective. So, we're looking at the React docs, and only other thing I want to mention while I'm standing here looking at the React docs is that all of these sections are important fundamental concepts to understand with regards to React. So we just talked about components, we talked about props, we talked about state, but in general, there's all types of things that you're going to want to do with your web pages that are important to know how to handle that within the React landscape, such as handling events. So if someone clicks a button, what happens? In another example, it might be like the drag and drop that we were just talking about before. So a drag and drop is an event, right? So it's an example of another type of event that you might want to handle creatively within your application. And you'll need some knowledge of state and some knowledge of these components in order to do that. Conditional rendering is a big topic, and we're actually going to dive into a little bit more about this today, as it relates to using state and using props and all of these different data to conditionally show different things to the user based on certain scenarios. So here we might have an example wherein we see a welcome page that has a greeting for a specific user and a greeting for another type of user. And rather than build two different web pages, you could build one web page that's smart enough to say, hey, well, if I'm looking at a user, I'm going to show one message. Otherwise, if I'm looking at a different one, show a different one, right? And so we've talked about conditional rendering before, but conditional rendering is basically the process of rendering something based on certain conditions, certain Boolean values, true, false, and just certain scenarios. Very important concept with regards to React. And then lastly, listing keys and forms are two other very important aspects of working on the web. We use forms for one all the time. Every time someone's typing in a search bar, every time someone is filling out information, right? Like you're using a form. So it's just common to know how forms work. Forms also become a space where people end up connecting their web apps to databases. So it's important to know that just also from the front end perspective. And listing keys, right? If you think about every website you've ever been to, one of my favorite websites to look at as it relates to kind of having this conversation about React is like SoundCloud or something, right? Some website that we're pretty much familiar with, right? So if you look at this website, right, it's a pretty standard website with regards to this landing page. there's this carousel kind of view that swipes through, and little search bar, right? Remember, like I just said, with forms, we see search bars all the time. So if somebody was typing in this, that would be an example of utilizing one of those form components. And then we see this dope section of like a gallery of different content, right? I could very easily see someone trying to code all of these different sections, right? You could probably imagine, hey, like, you know, maybe I want to create a component for each of these things. Well, right, that might make sense in the sense that you need a component for each of these things to show up to render something on the screen. But rather than make all of these 12 components individually, you might be able to save yourself some time and work by way of what? Creating one component that represents this item, right? Maybe we call it a SoundCloud card, and each SoundCloud card has a image, has this little section underneath it, right? And maybe a play button that pops up when the user hovers over it or something, right? That might be one component. And then we can create a list of those components. Rather than have all 12 be separated, we might just create one list that says, hey, you're going to have a list of 12 of these specific components that we're creating, right? So that's where this section about lists and keys becomes very important, because rather than just have all of those components just written out one by one, which takes up a lot of space, you could very easily just create a system wherein you develop a list, and lists typically use arrays. So one of the things you're going to need to know while working with a lot of data with regards to React is how to work with arrays in the process of rendering your components. So here in this section, list and keys, the React docs goes over that, like mapping over an array of values and returning some array of components or array of elements, JavaScript, JSX elements. And that's really important. We use that syntax all the time of mapping through something, and from the map, you know, returning something that will actually render on the component, and then rendering that, right, in a unique way. So that section is really important as well. And then the last three sections are really more mindset things. Well, this section number 10 is important too. It talks about the way that you use state in more sophisticated applications, wherein you might want to pass data between two components. In order to do that, some components are going to need to know about this data that's changing, and some components are going to need to be able to receive that data as props, right? Because remember, you can only communicate between components using props, and utilizing state is the way that you maintain some understanding of what data is changing over time. I don't want to give out too much away with regards to some of the folks I know working on some of the problem sets and exercises I gave out already, but there's certain conditions where you might not have state where you expect to have state, where you might need to put state in a different component because that component is going to be the one that's responsible for passing it to another component, for instance. And so that's what this section number 10, lifting state up, is about. Composition versus inheritance is about just understanding how different components can be created and extended off of one another. And this kind of goes into the object-oriented nature of, you know, working with classes and stuff like that. But the section that's really important to understand, all of this that we're talking about, React and components and which ones use state, which ones use props, is this section number 12, thinking in React, which is all about this mindset of how do I take some UI and break it into the components that I would need in order to create this in a React-based application. So they go through this example of this little kind of table-like structure with this input at the top, and how they would break it into different components. And from that, figure out which components would components would rely on state and need data stored in state, or data stored as props that are passed into it or whatnot. And you could think similarly about any website that you go on. After you've read this section, Thinking in React, I really encourage you to jump to one of your favorite websites and think about, well, how might I break this website down into components, right? So we already kind of talked about here, there might be components for each of these, but also just the way that this website is structured, you might see each of these bigger sections on the website might be their own component as well, just as a section for each part of the app. right? And the more sophisticated the app becomes, the more you might need multiple components to create it. Another great website that I like to use to just demonstrate what I'm talking about of reusable components is the New York Times website, right? If you go to New York Times website, first thing you notice as you scroll down is, right, you see these kind of like blocks of text and stuff like that, big picture sections and more blocks of text. Well, if you keep scrolling, you just see kind of how it just kind of keeps repeating, right? You think they built all these components from scratch, or like this web page has all of this just defined in scratch? Well, no, that would be really hard to build, right? So rather than do that, what they do is create components that they can reuse over and over again on their web page. Those components can just be represented in JavaScript and receive data that will change over time, right? So maybe right now this post says this, but in a different place, it might say something different because the data that was passed into it is different, right? But you can see from just looking at the UI here that it's very similar, right? They have a structure that they follow because this is supposed to feel like a newspaper. So rather than build something just off of, okay, I'm gonna build each section one by one, it's much more efficient to build each section in components that then receive data that changes based on a data set or changes based on some condition. And that's exactly what makes React a powerful tool. If you download the React Developer Tools, which is a Google Chrome extension, you can actually see websites that utilize React. And it highlights this icon here at the top that I'm hovering around, highlights it blue when React is present on a website. So clearly the New York Times is using React to build this website. It's not even like maybe they're using React thing. No, they're definitely using React. So, you can best believe that they're building this out with components rather than just building an entire just regular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript file from scratch for such a dynamic website with regards to the data that's changing over time. So that's what this thinking in React section is all about. And hopefully by tuning into these last few sessions and stuff, you kind of understand that. And I know that it takes time. It takes time to learn any new thing. So I'm not sweating you. And I don't want you to think like, dang, like he just said like all this stuff about components and state and props and, building my own. And I really encourage you to read through the docs if you're still in that position where you're like, I don't really understand, or look back at some of the previous videos that we took while we were going through this. But if you're rocking with me, that's great, because now you're kind of understanding this thought process in building React apps that doesn't change. It's the same process every time. You're figuring out what the components are that you're going to end up having to build, what the hierarchy of those components will be, and then how is data going to be passed between those components. And that's it. That's your job as a web dev, is just figuring those things out to get in relationship to the specifications that you have for your UI or for a client, or if the client has specific goals or things that they're trying to achieve. So one thing I want to switch gears to doing is showing you this in a more practical context with regards to some actual code. So we'll just make sense of that. And then we'll go through a new example and work more around seeing this kind of practical conditional rendering aspect happen in the format of like another type of application. So let me just switch screens real quick and we'll go into that. Before I do that though. Okay. So somebody was asking about, speed and like functionality of React sites with regards to optimizations. So React sites can tend to be slow if they're built, especially with the Create React App tool chain. There's a couple other tool chains that you can use to start your React projects that are meant to help optimize speed and whatnot. Some of those are like Next.js, which is another React tool chain that lets you start a new project in with a couple different features that make it a little bit faster because it's using a feature called server-side rendering. That's not necessarily what we want to talk about right now, but it is the case that, React is still pretty fast. I will say that, but in the grand scheme of getting content to the user faster, there's other alternatives to just the Create React App toolchain that can improve that speed very much, very quickly. So not all React apps are as slow. I wouldn't make that generalization, but certain React apps can definitely be slower than others, given how they're built, how they're structured, and if they're optimized or not for people's use. So let's just take a look at some of the just some actual code that is related to what we've been talking about. So I'm just close some of this stuff because I don't need it right quick. And last time we were working on this really simple application for task. It's like kind of like task management app, you could say. So while I'm walking through the code, I'll also just open the terminal and start it up. It might take some time, so just probably better that way. And so while that's doing its thing, let's just kind of recap what's going on in this application. So remember, whenever you first start a React project, you use different tool chains, or you can use different tool chains to get started, or you can start defining the packages and files yourself. In this case, we use the Create React App toolchain, which is probably the most widely used toolchain for development in React. And we built this project out. It gave us some really default files, but the most important file to look at is definitely the app.js, which basically is the first component that gets rendered. In this component, we can see that the biggest component that is the other component getting rendered in here is this task container. And the task container is its own component that clearly we're importing from a specific file that we created called task container. And that's inside of this components folder. So inside of this components folder, if I go to the task container file, that's where I see this, which is an example of a class-based component that we created to do something very specific for our application, which was hold a list of different tasks that our user is creating, handle the process of receiving new tasks from the form, which we'll see in a second, and render and return a form where the user can write new tasks and a list that shows those tasks off. So if I go back to the app, it's really basic right now. I'll just zoom in because it's so basic and type in a new task. Here's a new task. Submit, right? So we're getting this list going. So I'm just gonna type something random. More stuff, right? Cool. So don't bust my chops off of how bad of a design this is. You know, I could definitely style this better. But the point I was trying to make with this little application that we were working on is the aspect of React that is happening here, which is clearly we're saving a reference of all of this data that's changing, right? We're making this list is growing over time, right? I could also maybe add delete functions and remove things from the list. But the whole point of data changing is important to understand. The page doesn't have to reload. None of that has to happen, but clearly the page is updating based on what's going on data-wise with regards to the application. This is what makes React so cool, is you can create components that are going to grow and be flexible over time to the data that they're receiving. And that's where this idea of state and props comes in. So if we go back to this application, clearly we have three components that make up this application: the task container, the task form, and the task list. The task container is the one being rendered from the app component, but we didn't really change anything of the app component. All we're using the app component for is to render this bigger custom component that we created. That component, task container, is a class-based component. So the difference between a class and functional-based component is in, one, their syntax of how they're defined, but also the class-based components have access to very specific functions like constructor and render that get called at specific moments in their life cycle. So the constructor is a great place within the class-based component to create state. So whenever we're working with components that are utilizing state, a good majority of the time, you might see those represented in class-based components, because it's very simple to create state within those components. You just say this.state in the constructor, set it equal to some object. And remember, objects have key value pairs. So in this object, we have one key called tasks, and it's set to an empty array. And that's it for our state. So now we can reference this.state.tasks, and it's always going to reference this array that's saved in the state. So just to scroll down a little bit, the other big responsibility that this component has is to return and render our other components: the form, which has this input and button at the top, and the list, which has clearly this list that we're seeing here. So those two components are defined on their own. The task form is also a class-based component that has some state for processing the form data and the input that's the like people are typing in. And the list is doing something very simple, which is taking the data that it receives, and like we were talking about list and arrays, using that array of data that it receives to map over and create JSX elements in the form of a list that is showing up on our page. So this is all the code that it took for us to make it so that this list grows over time based on what data it receives. But in the form, again, some of the things that you see happening here are event handlers, which are the functions that get called as events are taking place on specific elements on the web page. So if you think about what goes on a web page, there's all types of events. There's clicks, there's types, there's swipes, there's drags, there's drops, there's all types of events, right? And each one of those events need a corresponding function to call whenever something's going on in that event, if you want to make use of the data from that event. And so this is exactly what's happening here. We have a function that is meant to represent whenever this input itself gets changed. So whenever someone is typing in there, this function handle input change should get called. And when it gets called, we're using that set state function, which again corresponds to the this.state that we're talking about here. And it says, hey, change this value that I set here of input data from being this empty string to being this very specific data that comes back from the event that we're seeing change. And this function is setting the state so that it's changing, updating. So wherever we're using the state, we can expect that this value is going to change. And that is what allows us in this render statement to take the input and process what's happening with as the input is changing and save a reference to it. The last thing that reference allows us to do is finally, when we're ready to submit and someone actually presses this submit button, well, now we can take that thing that they saved in state and pass it along, right? Or use it in a creative way. So clearly we can pass this.state.input data along to whoever needs it. And we see a really interesting syntax. I talked about it a little bit in previous sessions about this idea of callback functions, right? Where one component, again, might want to talk to another component. And again, the only way to do that is to use props. So a very interesting syntax that you see in the React, a very interesting design pattern that you see in the React ecosystem is this idea of one component. So in this case, it's our task container, is the parent component, right? And like we mentioned, the parent component is the component that renders or returns other components. So the task container is clearly the parent of the task form and the task list component. Being the parent, being the one that defines, hey, I'm going to return a task form or I'm going to return a task list, that gives this component extra authority to do certain things like pass prop data into each of those components. So here we see an example of us passing props from the task form or the task list into those relative components, task form and task list, such that they may use as props. So here in the functional component of the task list, we see props being used to map through this array of elements. And in the task form, we see props used as this callback function. So the task container passed a callback function by the name of onNewTask. It passed this function, handle new task, that gets called whenever this task form calls props.onNewTask. Well, we call that very specifically in this handle submit function, wherein after the user's ready to submit their value, we say, cool, we're gonna let the parent know, and we're gonna call that function it passed down to us as a prop. And we're gonna call that function with this data that was stored in state. So this is just a good example of state and props working together in a unique way with regards to just a more active component system and stuff like that. So yeah, other than that, this is just basic elements that you would expect to use to make this page look the way it does. Matter of fact, we only use one form, input, button, and a list from the task list, right? In unordered list. Other than that, we didn't really use any extra special elements to make this page work. We had to create these custom components, but we didn't use any special elements to make this up. We could have done this in regular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but it wouldn't have been as dynamic, and it wouldn't have been as able to update with regards to the changing data happening at the same time. So that's one of the things that makes working with React and all of this stuff very fascinating. And yeah, thinking about all of this comes back to this idea of just thinking in React, like the docs talks about, and understanding that, yeah, there's different needs that components can fulfill. You design the component and make the component work for you. So instead of having to design the same thing multiple times, you could design it once and put it as many times as you want, and understand that it can respond to data versus having to sit there very static. And that's, once you start understanding and grasping that, you're understanding and grasping the core of what React is. So yeah, just wanted to point that out. And to continue this conversation, I want to kind of just keep playing around with these applications and see some interesting things that you can do with regards to the conditional rendering aspect of working with state and working with components that are changing the state over time, and talking a little bit more about what's going on in those processes. So to do that, I'm just going to clean up this application. I think the task-based application really served us really well. So just like I did before, I'm just going to create a new folder for it and just save this inside of this file. So I can also put it up for y'all to take a look at in GitHub. So I'm just going to make sure I move these into this new folder. Oh, it's already in there. Move this into these new folder that I just created. And so now I can close these. Yes, update. I love VS Code for updating these imports for me, because I definitely would probably forget. So now that they did that, I can close this, make sure, yep, close this. And yep, these imports are still correct because they're all in the same file. So I can save and close this. And then here in the app.js, I don't need it to reference the task container anymore, because I'm just going to work on something different. And yeah, so I'll just clean it up. And instead, I'll just add a H1 and say a back in business. I'm gonna add just another styling thing into here, just for the sake of trying to make it look a little nicer. So inside of the app.js, and this is going to be an interesting portion of the conversation today, is talking about this styling thing, right? What's going on with these styles and stuff? So clearly, components can import CSS as styling. So this app.js is importing a file that is a CSS file, which does a very specific thing for the component. It takes any of the styling that was defined in here and allows for that component to make use of that styling by way of using attributes inside of the JSX. So just like in HTML, you can use attributes to connect your HTML elements to certain things in CSS or certain other properties. You can do the same with JSX. And so one of the JSX attributes is this attribute called class name, which allows us to give our element a specific class name that can be referenced inside of the React virtual DOM and then eventually in the actual DOM. So the CSS is coordinating with those particular class names. And that's where we see all of these different things come. Again, this app.css was created when we used the Create React App toolchain. So I didn't make this. This was just kind of the default that was there. So, but what I did want to do was grab this header class that they created that has some specific just properties for the page, right? Adds a background color, adds some height, adds some flex to keep things kind of centered and justified in a unique way. I'm just going to add that back in there just so that we see a page that looks a little nicer. So I think it's app-header. Just make app- lowercase h. And cool. So I'm just expecting that to, make the page look a little nicer. So cool. And again, that was just because I still have access to this app.css file. In a bit, we might change it, mess around and make our own CSS files, but that was just to get the ball rolling. And cool. So now I'm got just a default app.js with a very specific component that's rendering here. And next thing I wanted to talk about is just this idea of conditional rendering and how it connects with state to allow us to do very specific things that we just saw, like clearly with the task manager project, we just saw that we can manipulate the state using we can manipulate state, and in manipulating state, we can conditionally render our web page, right? So as we were adding tasks, the process by which, if I go back just real quick to our task container, right? Every time that form was updating, right? It was every time the task form got updated, what was really happening was this function, handle new task, which is the function that was passed down as a prop. Whenever that function got called, right? Remember, they were passing in the task form, we were passing the state when it submitted, right? We said, hey, call the parent function on new task that came down from props and pass this.state.input data, which is the data from the form. So inside of the container, every time props on new task was called, it was actually calling this function that is defined in the parent. And that's why we call it a callback function, because that function is specifically going to get called whenever from the child versus called from itself, right? And we never call handle new task in this particular component. It gets passed to its child, and the child calls it whenever it needs to call it, which is unique. And so in this function, what's going on is that the task container has state. It's using state. And in that state, it starts off with a very empty array. And then over time, as handle new task gets called, we continuously update the state by taking the old data and then adding the new task that came back from the function into that array. So the array continues to grow. But hopefully you can see what I'm saying here, with that all this is doing is making that the state is keeping track of this updating array. But inside of our list, we actually pass the state into the list. So now the list is being created conditionally, right? Because at one point the list might be empty, but at another point the list might have 5 items, it might have 10 items, it might have 100 items. But either way, the application was built to render all of that stuff dynamically. So dynamic rendering and conditional rendering kind of are similar. Conditional rendering, normally we add those like kind of conditional helpers like Boolean and conditional logic inside of the return and render statement. But dynamic rendering is very similar, which is this idea that we see here, which is that this component is created in a very flexible way where it's just expecting to receive data from its parent component in the form of props. And it's going to say, hey, I'm just going to expect that you're going to pass me the right data. I'm going to map over that data and return new list items based on that data. So, hey, you give me good data, I'll give you the list items for what you typed, and it'll all show up very dynamically in in this unordered list element. And the idea though is that, whether the data is 100, whether there's 1,000, this format doesn't ever need to change. It's dynamically going to render because the state of the application, the state of the application in the container is updating. And so state is really determining what we're going to see on the screen in that capacity. As this state grows, so does the list. And that's what is very interesting about working with state and working with props with React, is that you can really create these dynamic websites that can change very easily over time and through different interactions that the user might be facilitating on the web page. So back to kind of this situation of starting anew, I want to kind of get a deeper dive at that process of state being manipulated and us seeing it change and changing things with regards to state in our components. So what I'm going to do is create a new component, create a new set of components that we're going to just work on. I'm just going to create a new file here, and I'm just going to call it, let's say, tile. I'm going to call it tile.js. And we're just going to create a very simple component. For this component, let's just create a class-based component because we're probably going to end up using state. And now that I think about it, don't want to call it just tile component. Let's start with this component, and then I might make some more components. Let's do it that way. So first thing first, I'm actually going to make this component very very basic. So just to get back into the mindset of working with React, I'm going to just start the process of defining this class-based component. So remember, in order to start a class-based component, you got to import React from React, which is the React library. And after you import it, that's great, because now you can write your class syntax, which is class with whatever the name of the component is supposed to be, extends react.component. Open up your curly braces, and then inside of your class-based component, the only function you're required to write is this render function. So the render function is its own function, and that function has to return some JSX. So I'm just going to return a simple div right now. Inside that div, I'm going to say I'm a tile. And that should be good in terms of visual stuff. I'm just going to write at the bottom, oops, not extends. I'm going to write export default and then the name of the component that we're returning. So this is an entire kind of class syntax for creating a new class-based component. We have the name of the component. We have the render function that returns some JSX. Remember, JSX is just the visual aspect of what you want the component to show. It's broken into these little elements. These elements are the typical HTML elements you might expect, but they're converted into a JavaScript format that lets us do a little bit more dynamic work with them overall. So save this, and my formatter just edited it up a little bit, but next thing I want to do is just make sure that this is returning the right way. So I'm just going to import it in the app.js in order to just make sure that that's coming the right way. So so we're going to import the tile from this specific component / tile. So we got this new component we created here. We exported it with this default name of tile is exporting this. It's exporting this particular object that we created, this class. So here we can import it from that particular file with some type of name. And so we give it the same name. So now we can actually bring this component in. So I'm just going to bring it in at the bottom here, and I don't need it to close like that. I just need to close it like this. Cool. So expect to see something there. Nothing crazy. It's just saying I'm a tile, which is dope. So Dope. So we got something interesting going on in here with regards to bringing in that next component. So what I'm imagining doing now is to just continue this conversation of working with events and seeing things happen on the web page, interactions, because that's what we care about, right? Nobody likes going to a boring web page anymore. They want to see you be able to change things over time. So let's do that, help them out and build some interactive kind of components into this so that can make this web page a little bit more dynamic. So right now I'm just thinking about something simple. Maybe what we want to do is just mess around with this tile in a very specific way. So we've worked with forms before, but maybe we'll just work around changing some of this styling here. So let's go back and get into it. So in order to do this, I'm going to actually create a couple more components. So we have our tile component, which will just be this default kind of component that we'll work with in a second. But I want to make kind of like a container for this little bit of the application. So I'm going to make a new component inside of here. I'm going to call it tile container.js. And that component is actually going to be the one that I want to return the tiles, right? So rather than just return it straight up from the app.js, I'm gonna return it from this tile container kind of component, right? So hopefully I will have it kind of be like this, where tile container is the export. Clearly I still have to write it, so I'm just gonna do that real quick. Ooh. And so just to save myself some time, I actually threw the export default here at the top, which is something you also can do. So instead of having to write the export default at the bottom, you can also write it as you define your class. That way you don't have to particularly give it a name. It knows it's exporting this particular object that you've created here. So I'm just gonna render the actual div here. And inside of this render, I'm going to also make sure that I import at the top the tile from /tile. And that way I can render the tile in here the way I want. Save this, save this. Everything should still be the same. Whoops, that's my bad. Forgot, let's see. We got this render statement. Oh, whoops. Yeah, you got to put return statement in there. And all right, so cool. So that's good. Let me quit this. So dope. So same kind of setup, nothing really changed except that the app.js is no longer returning anything crucial. I'm just going to move this so that it's just a tile container in there, and cool, we got that in there. So first thing we might want to do is add some more kind of functionality into this application and do some unique things that can mess around with this component conditionally. So one easy thing that I can do, and is that exactly actually what I'm going to do. I'm just going to add a button in there. Buttons are a pretty easy element to use and work with. Buttons require us to, I'm just gonna say change me, or let's say change the state, right? And so buttons are a pretty simple element, right? I'm clicking on it, but nothing's happening. And that's because in order to work with buttons and other kind of events, clearly like the click that's happening is an event. So we need that button to know about that event and to respond to that particular event happening. So, so dope. So let's do that. The way that you end up manipulating events and like dealing with events is like we were talking about before, using event handling functions. So clearly in this function, I have this button and I want to change the state somehow. Well, you know, we haven't really even talked too much about like the state or any of that stuff yet. So let's just get to the point where we can make sure that our button is connected to a function, and we can make sure we use that function to start manipulating some stuff in the state. So first thing I'm going to do is inside of this button, I'm going to add a specific event handler for what is the event I'm looking for? Well, it's a click. So, okay, well, you know, there's a number of events built into JSX, that event listeners and handling functions that are built into JSX. Most of them follow what you would expect the regular HTML equivalent of this element to do. So if you looked up buttons in HTML, you'll see that buttons have a specific event handling function called click, but in React, whenever you want to refer to those event handling functions, you normally add the word on before whatever the event is, and you add a capital letter for whatever the event you're looking for is. So click becomes on click, drag becomes on drag. You know what I'm saying? Drop becomes on drop. And that's just a wink for y'all just regarding the stuff you might be building in the future. Either way, the on click is now an attribute that is this button and any other element, actually, because clicks can happen on any other element, can respond to. The only thing that you need to do to make this work is make sure that you pass a specific function into this on click attribute to call. So I'm going to just create another function here at the top. So I'm going to just make a new function. Let's just call it handle click. I'm going to make this function an arrow function. It turns out that arrow functions are very helpful to work with when you're working with React components. It makes your life a lot easier, especially in class-based components, with making sure your functions are able to represent the right instance of your class as you're calling it. So just good rule of thumb, use arrow functions. It just makes your life easier. So in this sense, now that I've created another function in this component, any class-based functions that I create, so if I have this function called handle click, or if I make another function called random func, right? Any function that I create in here inside of the class, I have to refer to it with this dot syntax inside of it. So handle click clearly is the function that I wanted to pass into the button. So I got to pass this dot handle click. And that actually allows for this to be representing this function to know, okay, cool. Whenever the button gets clicked, we're going to call handle click. Anything within the class-based component that you're referencing as a variable in that sense, or is going to end up using this dot syntax. So you use this dot handle click, you use this dot state, this dot props. And that's just something you got to get used to when you're working with class-based components. In functional components, you don't have to use this. It's a function, so it knows about that. It knows that you don't need to use this in functional components, simply put. Either way, we're gonna finish this up. I'm gonna just make this handle click, just make a little alert for us to say, hey, click me. Cool. And so now that this is set up, the hope is that when I click this button, clearly I get this alert that pops up that's like, boom, you clicked me. Great. So now our button is wired up, right? I could click this as many times as I want, and that's gonna still pop up. So every time this button gets clicked, this handle click is going to get called. So great, we got that up, and that's first step in this bigger sense of what we're going to do. Now let's just talk a little bit more about some of the styling things that's going on in React. Clearly, with the app.css, we saw that we can create our own CSS files that are telling our components about specific styling that it might need. So there's a couple of different ways that you can style components in React. And it's important to know that these different ways, and maybe you use one way over another in different settings. Whether you use Create React App or other tool chains, this might change, like how you define your styling. So this is very specific to Create React App, what we're talking about. But the concept of passing styling into your components is not unique to Create React App. You can do that with other React tool chains. But yeah, so in Create React App, we can use CSS files that we just define and import in order to pass styling information into our components. So if I want us to style this tile, I didn't expect that to rhyme, but that's pretty dope. If I want to style this tile, I can do that in a number of ways. So one way, easy way, would be to import a new CSS file, right? I don't have one yet, so I'm just going to go off the cuff and make sure, pretend like I have one. So let's say that I created a new folder inside of the source directory called CSS, right? And inside of that folder, maybe I have another file called tile.css, right? And in here, technically, it actually would be dot slash because CSS is out of the components directory. It's in the CSS folder. So if I were to do this like this, dot slash, right? Clearly, I want CSS slash tile.css. That's all you have to do in order to connect your component to a specific CSS file. But as you see, saving it, nothing really changed, right? We just see the same thing. So in here, right, the next thing you need to do is make sure that you have your component tied to some class name. So if I want to change the CSS, and this goes to all types of CSS, I need to use CSS syntax. CSS uses a selector-based syntax, which asks us to do two things in order to get CSS to show up. First, we need what's called a selector. The selector basically says, which element am I styling? And typically in the React-based sense, we normally use classes to represent our components. So here, if I want this component to get styled a type of way, I need to choose whatever its top level element is, which in this case is a div, and give it a class name. The class name can be whatever I want to call it. So in this case, I'm just going to call it tile. And now that I saved this, right, this particular div has this class name tile, which will allow me now inside of the CSS to reference .tile, which will be the selector. And inside of this, now it's looking for any element with this class tile. You might notice that there's a difference between class and class name, which is really important to note. In the React elements, you use class name. But in regular HTML, this would just be called class. But it's the same kind of concept of passing an identifier to our component. So, I might want to do some very specific things to make this tile a little bit more specific to see, or just a little bit more, give some styling that makes this a bit easier to work with, or just kind of represent ourselves on. So let's see, let's just add some just lightweight CSS to just play around with right quick. And let's just add a border to our component. So CSS also uses kind of this key value pair kind of drawn, where you have a key that represents the CSS property that you're trying to set, and then you can pass the values that you're trying to set. So border is a really interesting CSS property because you can actually, border is one property, but as you can see, VS Code tells you it's a shorthand for 3 other properties: border, width, style, and color. So you need to actually pass 3 elements into this particular thing. So we're going to put line width, we're going to say, let's just say 3 pixels. Line width 3 pixels, and we're going to say solid, and we're going to say white. And so now I would expect that our tile clearly has a little bit more nuance to it. So another thing that we might want to do is add some height to this tile. So I'll just add 300 pixels to it. Note that in CSS, you need to put semicolons. That's just important. And let's say width of 175 pixels or something. Okay, cool, right? So nice little tile, looks a little bit more like a tile, or what you might expect that to look like. and great. So we got some styling showing up. So this tile is pretty cool. So that's one way that you could style your elements with regards to React, is just whatever component you're working with, you can import some CSS into it. And just so long as the class names match up, the CSS will know that you're talking about that specific CSS. And another thing to be aware of is that components can inherit the CSS of their parent component. So for instance, the app.css that we're using here, because this tile container is being rendered in this app, and this component already is importing the app.css, you can also and you might accidentally pass elements from one CSS file into another component. So sometimes you might see like, oh, like there's like a discrepancy here. It might be the fact that there's a mismatch in component and what CSS file the component is getting its definitions for. So it's normally good to like name your CSS properties like very specific things so that they don't get confused with another CSS file in general. That's just a side note to this style of working with CSS. But cool. So clearly we just added this, we added this styling here, which is great. Now let's just keep building out this application a little bit to just be a little bit more unique. So what I'm gonna do is back in the CSS, instead of just having this background color of this tile be transparent, let's actually give it a background color. And let's just do something that we'll see. So let's just do yellow. All right, that's a little bright and hot and whatnot. So it's cool. It's cool for right now, but it's definitely a little bright. But at the end of the day, we get the point, right? We're seeing something come up here. So great. So I'm sure you can imagine what we're going to make that button do. We want to change this state to do something, maybe change this color of this tile or something. So let's just talk about how we would do that in with regards to styling and conditional rendering in React. So now we have our tile, we have a button. This button is set up so that whenever the button gets clicked, clearly we are able to get an alert. So the button is already wired up, but now we need to do this hard part, which is when this button gets clicked, I want to change the background color of this particular tile. Well, how might I do that, right? If we look at this setup, I have the button and the tile kind of getting rendered from the same component, the tile container, right? But how am I going to get the button to tell the tile to change, right? Like what's going to happen here? Well, this is a good exercise in working with React components using state and props, right? So if you were following along with some of what I was mentioning earlier, right, there's two different types of data that you can work with regards to manipulating components, right? There's state and there's props. Those are it. Props you need when you're communicating between components, right? State you need when something is changing data-wise within a component. So I'm sure you're starting to imagine which component might need to use state to change something and which component might need to use props to change something also. So let's dive into this a little bit more. So right now I have this tile that's defined outside of this button. So clearly I need the change from this button to impact what's going on inside of this tile, right? And I need the tile to be able to respond visually to that change. So in order to do that, right, we're going to need these two components to talk to one another. Somehow I need to let this tile know, hey, there's a color I need you to show, right? And I need that color to be unique. I need that color to change. And so maybe I need you to take, instead of like showing what you're showing, I need you to show a specific color, right? And I might need to use props. Well, I'm definitely going to need to use props to pass that data into the tile. But how are we going to get the color to show and all of this stuff to make sense? Well, let's just imagine that handle click in our button is going to do something very specific. It's just going to change the color to a specific thing. It's just going to let us know, handle click, we're going to say, hey, whenever the button gets clicked, we're just going to tell this component to switch colors, right? And that's it. We're going to say, hey, whenever handle click is called, we're going to tell the tile to switch colors. So handle click is going to have to let the tile know that it needs to change. So maybe instead of saying color to show, maybe what this component is going to need is something that says something like should change colors or something, right? And if we are, I'm thinking as I'm coding and going at the same time. So we're gonna have this button clearly manipulate the state and like change this tile up. The best way to do it, is subjective at this point, but either way, because of the structure that we chose, where we have these two components, we're gonna need to leverage props and we're gonna need to leverage state in order to make this happen. So let's make it. Let's make this work. So in order for this component to change, right, we need this button to let the tile know that some data is going to be changing. So the tile needs to have access to data that's going to be changing, but we also need to pass it data. So this is a tricky example where we're going to see us both use props and we're going to need to use state because we need data that's going to change. So in this sense, first thing I want to do is just make sure I have some state to play with. So I'm going to make a constructor inside of this class, and inside of the constructor, just initialize the super class. But biggest thing I want to do is create state. This state, set it equal to an empty object, and inside of that object, right now, I'm going to actually go with the color to show approach first, and then we might talk about a different approach in a second. So let's say that color to show is going to receive a specific color that we tell the tile to show. So in the state, I'm going to just create a color, right? A default color that we're going to start with. So we already have that tile starting at white, yellow, excuse me. So maybe we want to change it to like something like blue or something like that, right? So the state is going to have a specific color to set to it. And when handle click comes in, when this tile and color to show, let's just kind of set this up and see how we can pass this as props into our tile. So color to show is going to get this.state.color. Cool. So now we're not even going to worry about this button yet. We're going to actually see that in a second. Right now we have this tile that's receiving some props, and the prop it's receiving is this particular color, right? So let's just take a look at what happens now. So clearly nothing changed, right? Tile still expects to be yellow, but let's change this around so that the tile now is going to show whatever the style is or the color is that we told it to show. And in order to do that, we're going to actually need to do some stylistic conditional rendering. So we've seen conditional rendering with regards to the elements themselves, but we haven't really talked about style in CSS in that sense. So we're going to actually see another attribute that we can make use of. Clearly, we have the class name, which we can put tied to a specific class, and that's where we're actually having this set up to be set to yellow. But there's another particular attribute that is very helpful to use with all of your components and elements inside of those components. That is the style prop. So the style prop is the style attribute, is a specific attribute that allows for you to define some CSS inside of your component inline. Now, if we go to the React docs, they have a whole section about this stuff. I'm trying to think about where it is. Let's see. In advanced, where do they put this stuff? Let me actually just type it in Google, find it. Okay. Styling in CSS. So it's in the docs, but where is it? Oh, it's in the FAQ and styling in CSS. So there's a bunch of ways to add styling, right? We talked about the class name and like how you can define it with CSS, but the React docs is also going to talk about another way that you can leverage your styling. And it says here in this section, hey, can I use inline styles? And it's like, yeah, you can use inline styles. Here's how to do it. And so we're going to talk about that in a second. But then it's like, are inline styles bad? And it's like, classes are normally better, but that doesn't mean you can't use this, right? CSS in general with regards to React is interesting because there's two ways that you can create your styles. You can do what we just did with regards to using CSS, but there's another way where you can actually pass an object that has your styling defined in JavaScript for your component directly into the elements inside of it. So the style attribute accepts an object. Clearly div style is another object, right? And inside of that object are style parameters that you might want to pass in. So we're going to see why it might be helpful to have these inline styles right now, right? So the style prop takes in another object. So typically there's two ways you'll see people do it. One way is like how we saw in the docs, they'll just create another object elsewhere and then bring that object in the style. Another way that you'll see is people create multiple, like just create an empty object inside of the attribute, inside of like kind of like as you're passing the attribute, right? So you see two curly braces here, and inside of there, clearly this is another object, these empty curly braces, and inside of those empty curly braces, I can add my own styling parameters in there, just like they were doing here. The only difference is instead of creating a whole new variable, you just kind of define this thing inline inside of here. So you see both ways, but clearly the style prop I want to change is related to the background color. Now, one thing to note is if you're doing inline styles, this is where things get a little tricky and funky. Inline styles leverage JavaScript syntax for the names of those styles. So while in the CSS clearly is background dash color, in a JavaScript file, right? We're using JavaScript inline, so this is still JavaScript. The names of the CSS properties change so that instead of using this dash syntax, it uses camel case. So background dash color got replaced with lowercase background capital C color. But we can also pass this some data. And normally when you're passing data in the style inline like this, you're also going to be passing a lot of strings. So just note that, right? If you're passing inline styles, a lot of it's going to be strings. Whereas in CSS, clearly it's not like we're passing strings here, we're passing actual values. So here I'm going to pass a value. And I can pass whatever I want. So just to show you that this works, right? Let's just make this some very arbitrary color. So let's just make it black and see what that does to our app. Clearly our tiles change, right? If before it says yellow, so in the CSS, it's defined to be yellow. But because we gave it an inline style, the CSS actually got overwritten. So first it did the class name CSS. Now it's doing these inline style CSS, which clearly took precedence over the style defined in the CSS file. But as you can see, we pass in a very unique black background color. I said black, I can say blue here, right? We see that change, and red. See that change? Bet. So you see what's going on here. So clearly, if I pass a string with a color in there, I expect it to change. So, well, rather than just pass hard code this string here, what if I do what we've been talking about with regards to these React components, and clearly inside of this container, I'm passing a color to show as props. It's color to show. So inside of here, what if I change this to say, instead of that, I'm just gonna say this.props.color to show, right? This is all JavaScript. So I can still make use of the JavaScript this.props syntax inside of here, and cool. I see that blue come back from the color to show. So clearly now the container is defining what color this tile is specifically going to show, right? With this.state.color, right? And now this is where this gets interesting, right? Because now I have this button and I have this tile set up to have whatever color I want it to show is set as props. So this tile is receiving that color as a prop and passing it in here. And this button now can do something very cool, which is instead of just alert us that, hey, you got clicked, we could do this last step of saying, okay, cool. Well, whenever this button gets clicked, let's change the color. So this dot set state is how we change how we set the state of something to be different, right? And let's just change the color to be something different. So let's say pink. It has to be a string for this to work. So yeah, so whenever this gets changed, we're gonna expect this to turn pink. So let's see if this works now. So now I got this tile. I have this change the state. I click change the state, and cool, we see this turn pink, right? Clearly, this button is now wired up to change the actual design elements that we're seeing on the page. I'm like blanking, but we could actually extend this, right? So instead of just having like, oh, just change it to pink. Well, now we can do a lot of conditional stuff, right? If I want to conditionally render this, I could say, hey, well, if this dot state dot color is equal to blue, right? Then I say set the state to be pink. Else, this dot set state and change the color to blue. All right, let's do something different. Let's do it. Let's do blue here, but let's start this out at white. And cool. So it starts out as white, change the state is blue, change the state again is pink, right? So we can keep toggling now. Blue, pink, blue, pink, blue, pink. And clearly our component is just rendered one time. This tile is the same tile, but the difference is that tile now has its styling linked to some conditional logic, right? Whether the logic was related to props, in this case, it's related to props because the thing changing it is defined outside of it, right? So we have a button outside of the tile. If instead of this button being outside of the tile, if this button was maybe inside of the tile, like let's say the tile had a button inside of it, right? And inside of that, it's like change the color, right? Well, it'd be similar, but the difference is that inside of this tile now, right? If I had changed the color here, I would be able to now manipulate this tile from inside of itself. Well, if I'm talking about inside of the container, so let's say for instance, this button doesn't exist anymore. I'm gonna just grab this to make my life a little easier, right? That button doesn't exist anymore. So all we have is this button here, which isn't wired up at all. So inside of the tile, if the button was defined inside of this component, well, guess what? It's a little easier now too, because now this component is responsible for changing its own color. So it doesn't need props because it's not something outside of it isn't changing it, it's changing itself. So instead of doing it this way with props, we could do it with state, right? It'd be that simple. Well, where in here, we might have a constructor, right? And inside of that constructor, similar thing. I might have a this.state.color. Oh, oops, this.state, and set it the color to be defaulted to white. Then I might have this function for handling the click. And inside of the button, I just say on click, this dot handle click, right? And now whenever this handle click gets called, it's gonna call here and it's gonna set the state to be something different. And the state is set here. But since this is no longer getting this data from its parent, it's getting it from itself, well, I could just call state, right? So this would just be this dot state dot color instead of this dot state dot color to show, right? Because now it's getting the data from inside of itself. So if I take it now, right? And I got the same kind of functionality. Whether it's coming from state or from props, the idea is the same, that the component itself is rendered in a very unique way where the state is manipulating some aspect of the component UI. Whether the state was defined above it in the parent and then passed down as props, which is what we saw first, right, with this example, or if the component itself is maintaining its own state, then the component itself can change the state itself. And that's how these components in state and conditional rendering get connected with regards to styling. We see that we can use CSS files to kind of create styling that might not change that much. But if we want to create styling that is going to change, we could use really cool conditional logic to pass those particular style properties, different conditional logic that are different variables with regards to state and props that might change over the course of the component lifecycle. Last thing I want to mention, and we'll wrap, is that you might be curious, like, oh well, Cam, you said props can't change, so how is this prop changing? Well, that's what's unique about passing a state variable in as props, right? The prop itself wasn't changing before, like when we had it the old way, right? In general, I'm gonna just save this, but then I'm gonna go back to the version before, right? Clearly, this is still calling this dot props, right? But just because this dot props is being called, or just because this dot props is being called here, this isn't changing. We're never changing color to show. What's happening is inside of this component, the prop itself is set to something that's dynamic. It's set to the state. Because the state can change, that means that whenever this variable changes, that this component is going to get re-rendered with a new set of props. And that goes into component lifecycle stuff that we'll talk about next time. But just wanted to get y'all some prior context on how you can use state and props to manipulate the styling of your components, which definitely comes in handy and is used a lot when you start working with React. And yeah, I appreciate y'all for staying tuned and listening in. And I'm gonna stick around.